want to look at now is Edwin Morgan's In the Snack Bar, and it's another of those poems where Morgan has an encounter with a member of the public in the middle of Glasgow, and it's one of those things that seems like a really ordinary encounter, but it turns out to have some quite extraordinary significance. We start with the line, "A cup capsizes along the Formica, slithering with a dull clatter." And you've got quite a lot of sound work going on in the language here. So the cup capsizes. With cup and cap, you've got half rhyme. So the two syllables sound very similar. And it capsizes. That has a lot of connotations of a vessel that's been upended and liquid that's in the wrong place, like a boat that's turned upside down. And the half rhyme and the alliteration of cup, capsize and clatter, and the onomatopoeia of slithering and clatter, all just emphasise that this is an incident that's about sound, because it's the sound that's what everybody hears. So a few heads turn in the crowded evening snack bar. Evening is used as an adjective, so you get this lovely, concise, poetic description of the snack bar, the fact that it's happened in the evening and that there are a lot of people around. An old man is trying to get to his feet, and we get from the word trying the fact that he's really not succeeding, but the fact that the stool he's getting up from is fixed to the floor probably doesn't help him. He levers himself up and his hands have no power. Between them, these phrases suggest some sort of a machine, but it's a broken down machine. They emphasise the fact that getting to his feet, it seems like a fairly simple action, but he's actually finding it pretty difficult. And then he's up as far as he can get. We're still working the present tense. We've still got this sort of stream of consciousness telling us what's happening. The old man can't get up all the way, but he's up as far as he can go. His dismal hump has connotations of misery, and the fact that it's looming over him suggests threat, and the fact that it's sort of overshadowing him, forcing his head down against his will, connotations of violence and oppression. The fact that his gabardine is stained and beltless gives the impression that he's dirty and careless of his appearance. There's quite a lot about the old man that's initially quite repulsive, maybe even frightening. And Morgan goes on to reinforce that when he describes him as monstrous, like a monstrous animal caught in a tent. But there's something a little bit more pitiful as well. An animal trapped in a tent is helpless and blundering, maybe destructive, but it's also trespassing where it's not wanted. And there's a suggestion that this old man is something that's not welcome. His face is not seen, it's in shadow under his cap. If you think about any film that has a character where their face is in shadow, it's characters with dodgy motives that shade their faces, possibly so that they won't be recognised. And then the poet realises that the man is blind, and he notices his white cane. A white cane sort of serves a double function. It's partly there as a mobility aid, because we later see the old man using it to probe the stairs on his way down. But it's also partly there as a badge to tell other people that somebody is disabled. And when the poet says, "I notice his white stick," we realise that he is very much in the story as a character, and he's not just a third-person narrator observing the old man and observing what he does. The stick is scuffed and muddy, hanging from his right arm. It all feels a bit sad and pathetic and grubby and helpless. And then he gives us these three phrases that describe him: long blind, hunchback born, half paralysed. And with these three very condensed phrases, he sums up all the old man's disabilities. He then describes him fumbling with the stick, which has connotations of clumsiness and suggests that the old man has a lack of coordination. And when he says, "I want to go to the toilet," you've got those hyphens creating the pauses in his speech, and it happens every time he speaks, so it implies this hesitancy and the fact that he perhaps has difficulty speaking fluently. The poet persona doesn't know how to guide a blind person. How do I know that? because he says, I take his arm. There's nothing more frightening for a blind person than being grabbed by a sighted guide and shoved ahead of them into the unknown. Blind people prefer to take your elbow, and that's exactly what the old man says. Give me your arm, it's better. So they set off inch by inch, tiny little movements suggesting the slowness and the difficulty, and he says we drift towards the stairs. Drifting never sounds purposeful. Given that where they're going, it ought to be purposeful, but it's taking a long time. And then the simile, a few yards of floor are like a landscape, tell us that the distance and the obstacles to be overcome. If you're negotiating your way through a landscape, you would expect roads and bridges and stiles and things that you'd have to climb over and work your way around, which you might not expect really on a few yards to the door in a snack bar. In the phrase, I concentrate my life to his, we see an act of very deliberate empathy. The things that are listed that are the blind man's experience of this journey are very sensory. They're either things like the crunch of spilt sugar is a sensation, table edges are a danger to be navigated around, people's feet you might trip over, the hiss of the coffee machine. If you don't have the visual context that sighted people would take for granted of seeing what it is that's making the noise could be quite menacing, quite frightening. And then in this invented adjective slidey, he expresses the danger of a very simple puddle of water. When we get to the slow, dangerous inches to the stairs, slow and dangerous seem like quite incongruous adjectives for inches, but they emphasise how different the old man's experience is. This journey is fraught with danger. We get the description of how they set off and start down the steps, and I've already referred to him using his white cane to feel his way down. And then we get the lines, and slowly we go down. And slowly we go down. The use of and the repetition of the phrase shows that every step, they do them one at a time, the action is repeated and the words are repeated. White tiles and mirrors at last. These are very visual cues that you've arrived in a bathroom. They're the things that we see that tell us bathroom. Might not have as much meaning for the man that he's guiding. And then he shambles uncouth into the clinical gleam, and we get a real contrast between the clean geometrical bathroom with its straight edges and its white tiles, and then this shapeless, grubby old man with his dirty gabardine. The poet persona is looking away, looking into the mirror, giving him a little bit of privacy, and he sees his reflection in the mirror, and brooding suggests perhaps that the thoughts are unhappy. And the fact that his reflection is described as darkening the mirror, I think also suggests probably that his thoughts are not particularly cheerful ones. The line, an apology for living, it's a sad, ironic reflection that even the biological necessity of going for a pee is feeble and slow for this old man, and it takes him so long to do up his trousers and coat that actually the waiting for him, I think, becomes embarrassing, and the painful is probably painful for the poet waiting, and he can't stand it any longer, and he does up the last buttons for him, like dressing a child. And then when he asks if he can wash his hands, we get the hyphens again, reflecting his broken fluency and broken speech. He hasn't even got the strength in his fingers to hold the soap. But then we get a word, I think, that is the hinge on which this poem changes. He washes feebly, patiently. And I think patiently is the turning point because it's the first word that's used to describe him that shows respect. And it's commenting on a characteristic that the poet can admire. And you see that his response to that is that his own next action, helping him to dry his hands, he deliberately tells us that he does it gently. So his response to the old man's patience is that he becomes more gentle. The hand dryer is characterised as quite threatening. It's described as roaring with hot air, and the old man struggles with it, and that sense of threat continues with the word contraption, which suggests something unfamiliar that we're suspicious about. A machine that you thoroughly understand, you wouldn't describe as a contraption, and it's probably a word that the poet is using on behalf of the old man. Then we get the description of going back up the 2 flights of stairs, and you would expect this to be even more frustrating than the business of going down them, but it isn't. We've got this newfound sense of respect and compassion for the old man, and that comes through very strongly in the language. We get the repetition of the word climb. He climbs, and then we climb. And I think in that change of pronoun you get a sense of togetherness. He climbs with many pauses but with persisting patience, and he climbs steadily. And the word choice is just showing that increasing respect that the poet now has for him. Slowly we go up, echoes the earlier lines about going down, because it's exactly the same structure, exactly the same repetition. And then we get something that Edwin Morgan does in quite a few of his poems. He uses a word and almost immediately seems to contradict it. He leaves you with a sense that there's something more going on in the words. Faltering, unfaltering. It does more than just cancel each other out. The fact that he's faltering, he pauses and he's unsteady, but he's unfaltering in that he never stops going. He perseveres and he persists until he gets to the top. And then you get exactly the same technique again with endless, yet not endless, with the distance of the floor that's to be covered. And it emphasises the fact that it's apparently a huge distance, but the fact that the old man gets there. It's not actually endless, he does make it. And then it's described as a waste of floor. For me, it's suggestive of being a wasteland. It's almost a kind of no man's land. It's slightly hostile territory that the old man has to get across. Our poet persona doesn't go out to the bus with him. Somebody else puts him on the bus. And the conductor bends down to listen to where he wants to go. You get the sense of other people helping him as well. Wherever he could go, it would be dark, is symbolic of the man's blindness, but also of the fact that it goes on to say, yet he must trust men. We talk about blind trust or blind faith. And then he reflects back on what's just happened. Telling somebody that you need help to get to a toilet is embarrassing, or it would be for us. But for this man, it's normal because that's what he always has to do. No one sees his face, but he doesn't see their face either. And faces are important to trust and human contact. We look for people's eyes and we look to see facial expression. And he doesn't have those cues when he's putting his trust in the people that help him. Does he know how frightening he is in his strangeness under his mountainous coat? This acknowledges the fear that drives people to avoid the disabled and needy. But we've already been shown the respect that the poet has learned for this old man. His mountainous coat, his hands like wet leaves, emphasises how weak they are. And it made me think of fallen leaves and the fact that fallen leaves have been discarded by the tree, which makes them even more insignificant, even more pitiful. It's a rhetorical question. Does the old man know? We don't know. Even if he does, is there anything about himself that he can change or would change or should change to be less frightening? I think we'll have just to think about that one. And then his life depends on many who would evade him. Evade is maybe a slightly more passive word than avoid or shun. If we evade somebody disabled, there is a sense that we're not doing what we should be doing from this poem, because the poet does the right thing. But should we be blamed for it? I think he leaves that nicely open. The old man can't reckon up the chances. He has one task. His only thing he's got to do is to focus on surviving one day at a time, whatever the weather. It surprised me, the word August. I saw it as a colder, more threatening season, I think. And then he finishes with, "Dear Christ, to be born for this." The poet rails against the old man's plight. What a horrible thing to have to endure. The poem ends on this note of compassion.